So welcome everyone here in person and those joining us online to the Navigating the Future of National Security. And those of you that are here in person, I hope you enjoyed Ottawa's winter wonderland as you were walking in. It is quite remarkable out there. My name is Paul Samson. I'm the president of the Centre for International Governance Innovation based in Waterloo, Ontario, and we work on governance issues that are at the cutting edge of the digital transformation that the world is going through right now. I'm going to say one or two words before I introduce the speakers today to set the context, and I'm sure they'll be doing the same. But I wanted to say that where the state of national security policy is in Canada, that we really have to be attentive both to the breadth and the velocity of change, which seems simultaneously to be coming at us with intensity we haven't seen before. It's certainly becoming a more challenging place for Canada and its citizens, and I think there are a number of vulnerabilities and pressures out there globally and in Canada that are creating in a sense a perfect storm. And we've got the after effects of the pandemic, climate change, Ukraine and the Middle East wars. We've got geopolitical tensions. I think in our own backyard, we've got increasingly threats to security through disinformation, influence campaigns, and cyber attacks. With more powerful computers and generative AI, the quality of deep fakes and other attempts to spread false information are going to get more sophisticated by the day. We face a new world of threats as individuals and as a country. For these reasons, it's imperative that Canada undertake a comprehensive reassessment of its strategic approach to national security. Foreign policy, economic prosperity, IP policy, data governance, cybersecurity, AI regulation, trade, et cetera, are all linked. Adversarial states are seeking advantage across these areas, threatening very much Canada strategically in a very, very connected way. So that's the word I wanted to say by way of context. I'm now going to very pleased to introduce Jody Thomas for a conversation on navigating the future of national security. A few words about her background. Jody Thomas was appointed as National Security and Intelligence Advisor to the Prime Minister starting on January 11th, 2022. She has extensive experience working at senior levels in the public service in an increasingly demanding security operations roles, and that it's exponential. Prior to that, at the NSIA, she was the Deputy Minister of National Defense. She has been in the system for a long time. In 1984, she joined actually the Naval Reserves as 17, becoming the first woman on a Canadian military vessel, and she began her public service career in 1988, holding various roles, including Passport Canada, some significant operational roles, the Canadian Coast Guard as Deputy Commissioner of Operations. She's then served as Special Advisor to the Deputy Secretary of the Privy Council Office. So she's had very, very many distinguished and important roles. I would just note that when I was in government, I have seen Jody in action, and she is a true leader in the public service, is highly respected by everyone that works with her. So Jody will start the session with some opening remarks, and then we'll go to a fireside chat with our own Aaron Shull, who's a Managing Director and General Counsel at CIGI, and they will be taking the stage in one moment. So just a word of housekeeping here to close off. For those of you that are online, if we could ask you to submit your questions for the Q&A segment at any time. Virtual participants can locate instructions in the chat, and those joining us in person will find directions available on the table. So we'll do our best to get through as many questions as we can. And the event will be recorded and posted on our CIGI online site. So with that, I would like to invite Jody Thomas to come up with opening remarks. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Paul. That was very kind. I didn't join the Naval Reserves in 1984. When I was 17, it was 1980. I can't tell a lie. So I will admit that I tend to avoid stages these days, but I'm very happy to be here. I'm also happy to see some actual experts in the crowd. So as the questions get more difficult, I may call a friend or two or three. I think it's important that we're having this conversation despite my aversion to stages. I think perhaps more than ever, we need informed, nonpartisan discourse on national security. These engagements help us to understand the reality of the multifaceted threats we face and chart the path forward for countering them. And so thank you, CIGI. It's commonplace and probably becoming cliche to say that the world is changing rapidly. I'm sure many of you are sick of hearing the word unprecedented at this point. But let's put the last couple of years into context. I became the National Security and Intelligence Advisor to the Prime Minister in 2022, so I date all time from that moment. That's a little less than 2 years ago. Less than 2 weeks into the job, the convoy descended on Ottawa and occupied the capital and exposed us to rhetoric and online harm and the use of social media in a way we had not previously seen. The next month, Russia launched its brutal invasion of Ukraine. Since then, we've seen a range of crises: the ongoing war in Ukraine, the destabilization in Haiti and Sudan, Hamas's attacks on Israel and the Israeli response in Gaza, the growing clandestine threats such as foreign interference and cyber attacks, transnational repression, increased rhetoric and threats against public persons, politicians, bureaucrats, journalists, female journalists in particular. Authoritarian states with Russia and China at the forefront are actively challenging our national security. They are working to weaken our institutions by undermining the confidence of our citizens in our democratic processes. More broadly, they are undercutting multilateral institutions and international norms that support democracy. We routinely see sophisticated and persistent threat activity, including economic security threats, aimed at undermining our technological edge and the know-how that drives our knowledge-based economy. Mis and disinformation have become ever-present, influencing the attitudes and beliefs of our citizens, deepening divisions, diminishing trust in our institutions. And we should not underestimate the potency of this particular threat. In light of these challenges, we must be coordinated, share information, and make intelligence more actionable. And so we're adapting. One critical way we are adapting is by putting in place more robust, responsive governance. We're strengthening national security governance so that we can better understand, coordinate, and ultimately respond to these threats from the strategic through the operational and tactical levels. At the strategic level, the government recently established the National Security Council. The NSC is not just another committee. It is a forum to drive the big, tough, nuanced deliberations on key national security, foreign, and defense issues facing Canada. This represents a major shift in how Canada approaches national security issues. Looking at the operational and tactical levels, for a long time, we've done a very good job at gathering and assessing large amounts of intelligence. But what we haven't always done is given crisp advice on what to do with that intelligence to government. Intelligence isn't something to be admired. It needs to be disseminated. It needs to be tracked. It needs to be understood. And it needs to be actioned. We can't produce it for the sake of it. We need to produce it to be used in real-world applications in ways that advance Canada's interests. To that end, with colleagues, we've created a new Deputy Minister Committee on Intelligence Response, which examines intelligence, helps coordinate appropriate response, and develops related advice to government. This committee is helping drive the intelligence feedback mechanism and is making intelligence more relevant to the policy cycle as well. These governance changes are the first step in helping the national security community shift to thinking about intelligence in a more action-oriented way. But we need to continue to do more, and we need to continuously assess governance to ensure it meets both need and demand. Gaps in information sharing was one of the biggest takeaways from the Independent Special Rapporteur on Foreign Interference. And we've taken strong steps to address those gaps, improving how we share information between departments, agencies, with parliamentarians, and with Canadians. This summer, the Minister of Public Safety issued a direction that parliamentarians will be informed of threats to them whenever possible, and within the law, protecting the integrity of investigations. Looking broadly, we need to speak more about national security, the threats and the challenges we face. And we need to do it in a manner that is transparent and clear, that is understandable across diverse languages and cultures. We have struggled with this in the past because we were singularly focused on protecting information, but intelligence can no longer exist solely within the confines of our own national security networks. Take, for example, GAC's Rapid Response Mechanism. In October, it released a report on a spamouflage campaign connected to the People's Republic of China, which targeted dozens of MPs from across the political spectrum, including the Prime Minister, the leader of the official opposition, and several members of cabinet. By increasing transparency, we are building a more resilient culture of national security across Canada. The public inquiry into foreign interference, led by the Honourable Marie-Josée Augue, will no doubt lead to more lessons and advice on how intelligence can be more effectively disseminated, consumed, and acted upon. Well, some of these lessons can be addressed through governance. We also need to look at the legislation and regulations that underpin the national security framework. The CISIS Act was written before the internet was available. Public safety is working on changes that could be advanced to allow CISIS to better operate in a digital world. It is critical for Canadians, including members of diaspora communities, to have confidence that their national security agencies are working to protect their interests and respect their charter rights. So modernizing the CISIS Act will require robust dialogue and consultation. Working with enforcement partners and national security agencies, public safety and the Department of Justice are also assessing the Security of Information Act, the Criminal Code, and the Canada Evidence Act to identify if amendments are needed to deter and respond to foreign interference. I encourage everyone here to go online and add your voice to the public consultations underway on these issues, because I know every one of you has an opinion on it. So please engage. These reviews will help intelligence and law enforcement agencies to better detect threats, assist Canadians in protecting themselves, and hold foreign interference actors to account. As always, any new power or authority must be paired with rigorous accountability. We cannot have public trust without accountability. And without trust, our security can be compromised. It's one of the reasons I'm here today, to talk about it. Public engagements like this one, where senior officials from the national security community can speak openly about our business and about the threats facing our country, are important opportunities to improve transparency and build trust. NCIRA and NCCOP reports are also a valuable source of information for parliamentarians, Canadians, and those working within our community. These two review organizations complement one another, performing essential review and compliance work and considering the broader framework for national security and intelligence, respectively. NCCOP's first report on foreign interference remains a valuable resource on the subject, and their upcoming work will continue to provide balanced assessments of the challenges we face. NCIRA is also undertaking a review on foreign interference that specifically examines how we produce, disseminate intelligence on the matter, including how we communicate intelligence within and across agencies and departments. There have been growing pains, to be sure, as we strengthen our review mechanisms and improve our transparency. Departments and agencies are working quickly to build capacity to support independent review, and Budget 23 provided $53 million over 2 years to support departments and national security and intelligence agencies in fulfilling their obligations in a timely and efficient manner. And we will continue to embrace the value of strong accountability structures. So I'll end where I started. From my time as Deputy Minister of National Defence to taking on this current role, I've seen a significant evolution in our environment, not just in the threats we face, but in the way we respond. We are building our capacity to anticipate and adapt to threats. We are more agile and more collaborative rather than being siloed, and we are growing a more diverse workforce that is inclusive and representative of the populations we serve. Canada has not been known for robust public engagement on national security. When we look at public opinion polling of top issues, Canadians most frequently cite cost of living concerns, health, or the environment, and that's not without reason. But Canadians are increasingly interested in national security. I believe there is a growing understanding among Canadians that we cannot take our security for granted. And there is growing recognition of the interconnected nature of economic, social, and environmental issues with national security. The public inquiry will bring the topic of foreign interference to the forefront of our national discourse once more. The conversations will not only intensify as we the conversation will only intensify as we approach our next elections, municipal, provincial, and federal. We need to talk clearly and precisely about the threats we face, raise the level of understanding about how international actors are working at cross purposes to our interests. It's why I value organizations like CIGI and all of you here who have a vested interest in finding solutions to these issues. You're doing important work to advance our national conversation on pressing security and intelligence concerns. So thank you all for being here today, and I look forward to your questions. I sort of look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much for that, Jody. And let me maybe start with two words that I don't think you often hear in your line of work. Thank you. I think it's often that in the public discourse, there's a certain negativity, and it's always about things that have happened that have gone wrong, and we don't talk about the things that go right, and we certainly don't talk about it publicly. So I just wanted to maybe set the record straight at the beginning, and thank you for your work.
Thank you.
And I want to pick up on something to me to set the context here. You talked about outreach, and for me, outreach is very much a two-way street, and working in a think tank, when we started our national security program, I think we had our business model wrong, which, as near as I could tell, was that we would write glossy, high-minded reports, and then we would chase policymakers after the fact and say, hey, listen to us, we're really smart, we think you should do these things. And I think approaching this with humility and knowing that we don't all have the answers, and that it is an open conversation and it is a dialogue. And so I just say that to say this, so thank you for coming here and engaging in this dialogue, because for me, outreach, there's reaching out and then there's reaching back. And so if we're doing our job properly at the think tank, we're reaching back. So thank you very much. Now, let's get into it. It's not often I get to sit down with the National Security and Intelligence Advisor, the Prime Minister, so I've got a whole bunch of questions that I wanted to chat about. But I maybe starting with like the position itself, because I know it was augmented in 2003, but I don't think most Canadians know what it is or what you do. And so how, in your mind, has the role evolved during your 2-year tenure? And maybe if you could say a word or two about what you think the big misconceptions are that Canadians have about security and intelligence and the role of the NSIA. I'd be grateful for your thoughts on that.
That's a big question.
It's a big question, I know, but please, yeah.
Well, it is a position, of course, that exists in Crown prerogative, and there's been a lot of recommendations over the years that the position should exist in legislation. I'm not a person who is an advocate for that. Privy Council office operates under the Crown prerogative, and I think this position should. The position is largely dependent upon the incumbent, the Prime Minister, and the community, and what's going on. When I started, we did not anticipate the convoy being what it is, and so I very quickly had to, I knew most of my colleagues, but national defense, I had a different perspective on what they did, and my interactions with them were different. And we rallied as a community, and I think you saw that during POIC with those who testified. We had to rally as a community, and I very quickly learned a lot about us. If my predecessors were concerned about a number of things, they were concerned about NAFTA, they were concerned about Afghanistan, they were concerned about the Middle East. We've been hit with a whole new set of problems and a different set of perspectives that are required to address them. Foreign interference, intelligence dissemination, intelligence collection, a war, which Canada, as part of NATO and the G7, is actively working to assist, not participate in, but assist. The destabilization in the Middle East has changed so much with the Hamas attack on Israel. And so the job is shaped by the environment and events. And I think it should be, because I don't think it should be a rigid position. I don't think it should be something that is dictated that you can only do X, Y, and Z. It convenes, it challenges, and building the cooperation and relying on the cooperation of the incumbents of the departments and agencies is kind of critical to it. And I'm actually enormously fortunate that it is an extraordinary group of deputy ministers and agency heads that I am working with now and have been for the last 2 years. And I think the work we have done together on a number of fronts has been really quite remarkable. And what is unique about the community is that nobody's afraid to be challenged. They want to improve. We want to evolve. And so we have very robust conversations. I think what Canadians don't understand about the position is, I think the model they see is the US model. And Jake Sullivan out doing a lot of press. It's a completely different structure, of course, in the United States. Our position is growing and evolving. What I do is give advice through the clerk, generally to the Prime Minister. If I disagree with the clerk, I can go to the Prime Minister directly. I've not had to do that with either of the clerks I've worked for. And we provide, as the Prime Minister's department, consolidated advice on national security. He still goes out to the experts all the time. He'll speak to CSIS, he'll speak to Canadian Armed Forces, he'll speak to CSE directly. But he wants to hear from a consolidated voice from the community. And he wants to understand what he is to do with the information we give him. And that, I think, is the critical part of this job.
And I don't want to sound like I'm the president of the fan club, but I would just maybe underscore what you said about your colleagues. I know many of them, I work with many of them, and the level of dedication and professionalism is truly outstanding. And I mean, the hours that they put in, the stress that they're under continually, like it is a tough gig. And so just say that to underscore what you said about your colleagues and the high degree of professionalism. Maybe there's a thread kind of running through here. So, and I appreciate your point about the position operating within a broader ecosystem. And so, I mean, obviously the big news was the creation of the National Security Council. Maybe could we pick up on that a little bit? And in your mind, why was something like that necessary? What's the point of the Cabinet Committee? How's it going to work? Like, tell us a little bit more about that.
So the committee is chaired by the Prime Minister, which I think in and of itself is significant. And we have set up a new secretariat in PCO to support it. So it's got its own program, subcommittees supporting it. It's not being treated as just another cabinet committee. It is its own function, which is sort of based on the UK model. Why it matters is cabinet committees tend to evaluate memorandums to cabinet. They assess what programs we're going to undertake, how much money is going to be recommended to the Minister of Finance is spent on anything. And this is the National Security Council. We are striving, and we've had a few meetings, to look at long-term strategic issues. What's over the horizon coming at us? If we want to do something about, name a subject, foreign interference, we should have been working on the solutions 10 years ago and assessing the technology coming at us, assessing the interests of the countries who are working contrary to Canadian interests and values. And you can't fix the situation in the moment. So it is absolutely about the long-term direction we need to take. Robust discussions based on policy papers, which is a different approach for us, and the intelligence underpinning those policy papers, which the ministers are all briefed on and have read coming into the committee. And then there's briefings by deputy ministers who are the subject matter experts, and then a discussion. And the discussions have been robust, and they've been useful. And then the Prime Minister gives direction on what he wants departments to do. And it's not something that's going to see an MC coming to a cabinet committee in June. You've got a year's worth of work to do to come back with a plan on any given subject. Obviously, I'm not going to talk about the subjects that we've discussed because that's cabinet confidence. But so far, I think we have seen the benefit. We've seen the engagement, the interest, and the seriousness with which the issues are being discussed and addressed.
Nice, and for what it's worth, I mean, I really appreciate it for a couple of different reasons. First, CIGI had done a major program of work in this area. We had about 250 experts, some 65 officials, many senior officials kind of contributing to the program, and my colleague Wesley Wark and I, and among others, have been talking for some time about what we thought was the need for a National Security Council, and so to see it then created is somewhat edifying and gratifying. So it's nice to see that, and for me too, like I was thinking about it, like I was out in the public on this, but I thought, you know, you've got the incident response group as the kind of highest order creature in government to deal with national security threats. And I thought, but it's exactly like it sounds, right? An incident's happened and now we're responding. We're by definition on our back foot, like, oh, something bad's happened, now we have to respond. And there's a time and a place for that, but the world is clicking along at a really brisk pace. You know, if we were having, well, you know, I had this conversation with your predecessor, you know, a couple of years ago. You couldn't even have imagined the changes that we would see in the intervening period, right? And so it's not about responding, it's about leaning in and having strategic frameworks in place. So I just wanted to underscore that I appreciate the creation of the NSC. I think it's a step in the right direction, and CIGI was talking about it too. So it's nice to be part of the conversation.
Well, feel free to take credit. I do want to say that the incident response group, though, we shouldn't discount. It's been extraordinarily useful for us. It gets ministers in the room, experts briefing, and very rapid direction. We used it through the convoy. We've used it through the horrific forest fire season we had this last year. We've used it for a number of things. So as an evolution of how our governance is functioning, it's been really, really useful. But yes, this is the strategic long term, and it was needed.
Yeah, totally. I mean, it's two parts of the elephant. One's touching the trunk and one's touching the tail. But I mean, it's important to have that perspective. So maybe I want to pick up then on the role that you have in kind of coordinating the community and bringing all the bits and pieces together without a statutory authority. And so I can imagine that could be challenging at times. So would you talk to us about what you think the obstacles are associated with coordinating a fairly broad community of actors, and then also now with this new cabinet committee? Tell us about the challenges that you're facing, or the opportunities too.
So you're coordinating a group of deputy ministers who are all type A personalities, experts in their fields, have their own work to do. They're busy, and they're not necessarily interested in what I'd like them to talk about at any given meeting on any given day. So that's the good. The challenge is people are busy. Agencies are small. The demand is high. The demand on deputy minister time is enormously high. And people have their own accountability in our system of ministerial accountability of delivering for their ministers. And so I am often taking them off that track onto other things. Incidents, other policy work that is not necessarily what they're focused on. And so it is a matter of building a rapport with people, and I'm very fortunate that the group of people I have to work with are A, expert in their field, but B, really focused on moving the agenda forward. But it is difficult. We have, demand from the Prime Minister's office for certain things to go forward. That's not necessarily the priority for a department on any given day. And so, there's just a lot of negotiation all the time. And that's interspersed with the constant crises. The day starts off with 5 meetings planned. You wake up, if you're lucky, you get to wake up in the morning as opposed to be woken up in the night. And the headline of the day or the information coming in from overseas sets the day in a completely different track. And so deputy ministers and the leaders of the agencies are working on whatever that urgency is, and their machinery underneath them is still having to grind forward on what the agenda is. The complexity of the bifurcation of brains from long-term policy work and immediate reaction to what's going on is kind of remarkable. And so it's a lot of cooperation, it's a lot of collaboration, but I think the model works, and I'm not an advocate for changing it.
And I can relate a little bit. So I've worked with some of your deputy ministerial colleagues, and I note that Shelley Bruce, who's also here, when she stepped down as the chief, joined CIGI as a distinguished fellow, and oftentimes I feel like I've got a part-time job working for her.
Yeah.
So
we all felt that way, for the record.
So no, I can relate, and it's one of those things where you just can't let the urgency of the moment crowd out stuff that's important, but that's long term. And I know that there's always a push to do that because there's just so much stuff coming at you. So I do appreciate the trying to set aside some time for focus on strategic level priorities and the long term game. Maybe I want to kind of go in a bit of a different direction. So. I want to talk a bit about transparency.
Okay.
So, obviously Canada's got a commitment to transparency in the national security world, but there's an inherent tension there. And so there's a desire to be transparent because I actually think it helps create social license. The more open you are, the more social license you'll have. And I've even heard some people say, in order to stay secret, we need to be more open. So can you tell me a little bit about that inherent tension between trying to be open and create social license and have a conversation with Canadians, while at the same time you got to keep some stuff secret, and probably some of the most important stuff?
Yeah, I think that's the challenge of the day, frankly. So it's more than we need to keep things secret. We're required by law to keep some things secret. And so that's one of the reasons why these consultations we're doing are so important. CSIS can't share information with the people it needs to share information with in 2023, as an example. And so threat reduction measures and various activities that they take on no longer suffice when we have to talk to municipal politicians, when we have to talk to provinces, when we have to talk to opposition politicians about what is happening in the national security sphere, let alone to Canadians writ large. And so I think we need a modernization, which we are undertaking, which will assist in the conduct of the business. But we do need to look at other elements of intelligence and information sharing. We don't have a policy on declassification. It is easier to declassify intelligence in the US than it is here. And so that is something that we need to look at. Right now, the responsibility falls to Caroline Xavier and David Vigneault, and I'm not sure that that's necessarily fair to them. We have to be able to explain threats without exposing how we learn the information. And so we have to get better at sort of writing to release a lot of the reports we do and the intelligence that's collected and the reports that are written about that particular intelligence. I think we need to do things like this more often. And not just me, obviously. I think Carolyn and David do a lot, Sean Tupper, Trish Geddes. CAF is really quite good at getting out and talking about the threats, but we also have to talk about what we're doing about those threats in a way that is understandable, digestible, and realistic. And so transparency is critical. It's also critical for populations who feel they are under threat by these agencies. And the foreign interference issue has brought that to light. Diaspora populations who feel not only threatened potentially by the countries they left through transnational repression, but also through investigations that are being done by the security agencies. And so being able to talk to them in a more overt manner, I think will be one of the critical challenges and tasks of the next 12 to 18 months as we go through the legislative changes that we want to do in the consultation process. And we'll use that consultation process to hear and understand what people are thinking about what we do and how we're going to respond to it.
Yeah, I like the consultation process. I think having that conversation is fundamentally important. And I also think, there's a compelling reason behind all of this, right? So to the extent that we can have a conversation about the reasons behind the why behind the what, it's not as though you're making it up as you go, right? There's a compelling reason behind this type of stuff. The world is in a really tricky spot. There are genuine threats, and so all we're thinking about is how best to respond to those threats. And so I think to the extent that we can have that conversation and provide the reasons and the logic and the justification behind the why, I think will help carry the day. And maybe like thinking about the kind of contemporary landscape. I mean, since I spoke to your predecessor, we've got a war in the Ukraine courtesy of Vladimir Putin's illegal, and I would say aggression. I mean, this is completely unjustified, a horrific war. We have Hamas's attacks, and so I want to maybe think about the importance of the national security framework in the context of contemporary events. So can you talk to us a little bit about how you see the need for a robust national security framework in light of what we're actually seeing in the world right now? It's a nice light question, too.
Yeah. So I think what is critical, I'm not sure that we need, as you framed it, a glossy report from national security departments and agencies about having a national security policy. I think that Global Affairs Canada, Foreign Affairs, CSIS, CSE, D&D, we need to work together to understand and explain what the threats are and what we are doing about them. So, and the tools that other countries who are maybe have done things we haven't, whether they're working or not, we need to start to assess rather than just list. We need to actually do rather than just list what the problems are. We are in possibly the most complex time for the world since World War II, maybe since the 1960s, but since World War II. And what does it mean for Canada and Canadians? We are seeing, as a result of what's gone on in the Middle East with the Hamas attack on Israel, social division in Canada, the likes of which we've not seen previously. World events are hitting us at home in a way they have not previously. And if we don't talk about those events, I don't think they're well understood. If we rely on social media, mis and disinformation to inform Canadians, we will fail Canadians. And so we need a national security framework, certainly, but we need discussion that is relevant, that is honest, that is not partisan, that is not political, about what's going on and how we can respond and play a role. Our role in the G7, our role in NATO, are critical to Canada's ability to have an effect and an impact in the world. And I think the G7's importance has really come to the forefront between the Russian invasion of Ukraine and now what's going on in the Middle East. The G7 leaders are speaking frequently. There is a responsibility upon democracies to play a role in the world, even though I think democracy is really quite fragile right now. It is incumbent upon us to try and find solutions. And those solutions aren't all military, they're diplomatic. They're through the exchange of intelligence. When we saw the usefulness of the exchange of intelligence and the declassification of intelligence in the early days of the Russia-Ukraine invasion. So the days of having a foreign policy that you could rigidly adhere to, a national security policy that you could rigidly adhere to, I think those days are maybe have passed us by a bit, which doesn't mean I don't think we should put things in writing. It means that if the UK did their integrated review and had them pivoting to the Indo-Pacific, and then Russia invaded Ukraine and they pivoted right back to Europe. I think what we need to be is nimble and flexible and able to assess what's going on in the world and give advice to government on how to respond and how to ensure that our people overseas are able to do their jobs representing Canada and helping to resolve situations. I think that we are seeing the impact of climate change around the world in a way we would not have anticipated 20 years ago. We've seen the Canadian Armed Forces used domestically. Even when we wrote SSE, and it was published in 2017, SSE did not anticipate climate change affecting us domestically to the extent it has. So while I'm not against formal policies, documents of that nature, I think that sometimes they're overtaken by events the minute the ink is dry. And so what we have to have is an evergreen understanding of what our agencies and departments need to be able to do their jobs, to be able to respond, to be able to give advice, and to be able to inform Canadians of both the threats and our response to them.
Wow, there's a lot going on there. That's a really solid answer. Maybe I'll just reflect on a couple of pieces. The need for agile policy frameworks. I really appreciate that, right? We have a tendency to let the perfect get in the way of the good. And so for me, a lot of the times, strategy is delivery, right? And the world is clicking along so fast. And I appreciate what you said about the integrated review. I thought the UK did a phenomenal job. The way that they set out the kind of threats in the world type stuff was like a master's class. And you're right, they snapped, it was 2 years, and they snapped back. And, you know, I appreciate the need to be nimble in the world, because your policy framework needs to reflect your goals in the world, and the world is changing all the time. And so being able to articulate that in a sensible and mature way, kind of call your shot, but you don't need to put a ribbon on everything, right? So and even like you mentioned, strong, secure, and engaged. I really, really liked that document. I thought it was great. I think the description of hybrid threats and gray zone conflict in that document is the best I've ever seen. But interesting point, guess how many times the words artificial intelligence are mentioned in that policy? 0 times, right? So to say that, again, the world is changing, right? So climate change, like the deployment of Canadian forces for humanitarian assistance and disaster relief missions, artificial intelligence wasn't really much of a thing, and now it is the thing. And so just being able to be nimble, I think, is important. And to your point about transparency and nonpartisanship, you know, I think that's one of the services that CIGI is very much trying to provide in this area, because we are fiercely nonpartisan. And for us, it's about good policy without politics. And so just trying to contribute our voice to that conversation.
Well, I think it's an important voice. I also think that, you know, we mostly know what needs to be done. It's a matter of moving it forward, getting the money to do things, having the proper cabinet discussions. Where I think CIGI and think tanks can be useful is, let's take something like the Foreign Agent Registry. Other countries have them. Are they working? There's still foreign interference in those countries. What happens if you don't have the criminal code violation that goes with not registering? Is it then useful? Is it useless? Does it make a difference? That kind of analysis from those of you who have time to think is really appreciated, because I think most of us know what needs to be done. It's just the tools are, the threats are evolving faster than the tools can. And we need academia, and we need certainly private sector to assist us in understanding and adapting to what's out there.
And that's, again, we're trying to be as helpful as we can, because we're not in the thrust and parry of day-to-day operations, right? We've got the luxury of some distance from this. So now, it wouldn't be a conversation with CIGI if I didn't ask about technology, right? So I want to talk about where you think technologies represent the greatest emerging threats, you know, weaknesses, opportunities to Canada, because, you know, a lot of this flux is underpinned by rapid technological evolution. And so again, like, as the strong, secure, and engaged, good document, super thoughtful, doesn't talk about AI. Now it's a huge piece of just about everything. So where do you see the technology lens on all this?
So I will acknowledge there are people in this room who know more about this than me. I'm looking at Shelley and David and Tricia. But so I think there's a couple of things. One, The theft of, as I said in my opening remarks, the theft of our technological advantage by countries who are out to do us harm, I think is an enormous threat. And it's something that we need to be very, very vigilant about. Academic institutions, research security, the Investment Canada Act, and protecting foreign investment in Canada, protecting the sale of technological companies and resources to countries who will not use it in a way that is helpful to Canada, I think is really critical. And so I think there's an element there that's really important. I think that we need to look at technology from a number of lenses. Everything is dual or triple use. So dual use, military, intelligence, and civilian. So that's a really positive thing. A lot of new technology is coming out of military usage, and it becomes civilian use. Really positive, but it also can be used by our adversaries in a malevolent way that harms us. And the work of the next forever is going to be understanding that malevolence and understanding how it's used against us. We have elections coming up. How are deep fakes going to be used against us? And it's not just us. I was in Washington yesterday having conversations with my US colleagues about this. It's something I think the Five Eyes need to look at as a group as we share intelligence. And I know that my colleagues are talking to the Five Eyes constantly about this. Knowing it's out there doesn't mean we can detect it. So how do you detect it? What do you do? How do you tell a deep fake? What tools are there? We are seeing, as I said, the potency of mis and disinformation, and that is driven by technology. It's driven by, sometimes it's just social media and things take fire, but the harm that is caused is remarkable. 9/11, that those terrorists came from Canada, that still persists in some corners. What happened just recently on the Rainbow Bridge? Somebody said that car was driving from Canada to the United States. What happened at the Rainbow Bridge was just a horrible tragedy, but it wasn't Canadian terrorism harming the United States. That still persists. And so mis and disinformation, powered by technology, powered by artificial intelligence, powered by those who wish to do us harm, is harming us now. And our ability to do anything about it is quite limited. And so it is an enormous focus of the Clerk of the Privy Councils right now. I know that intelligence, I know that defense is looking at an AI strategy. I know that CSIS and CSE are both looking at how they impact us. We don't have the answers yet, but it is the work of the next forevers. And it is something we should all be concerned about. And it is something we cannot do in government on our own. We need to work with private sector. We're not as agile. We don't have the research capacity. We can't move things as quickly. And so this is something that I think has got to be a government private sector partnership to understand what's coming at us and how AI and technology are used to advance Canadian interests, but how it's being used against us.
I love it when this happens. I feel like we're playing the newlywed game because my next question was actually about the private sector, and I don't know if you've got my notes here, but I want to talk about the private sector because when I think about it, and I'm maybe just for the benefit of the audience, we've made big promises about taking questions from the audience, and I've got a whole bunch coming in, so I'll ask my last question, and then I'll move over to questions from our friends and colleagues in the audience. But the private sector, I see it as a bifurcated challenge. On the one hand, for security and intelligence services, much of the best kit is actually in the private sector now. Like the open source stuff is pretty advanced, the data analytics, the AI stuff is pretty advanced. I know the former head of MI6 talked about that, right? Because we're not, putting phones in shoes anymore, or, cameras in canes or whatever. Like it's a very different world in terms of the tools that you need, and there's going to have to be a relationship with the private sector there that maybe didn't exist previously. Challenge number one. But challenge number two is that Canadian companies are on the front line. Like, it must have been so much simpler back in the day when it was like spy versus spy. But now private companies are part of this, and hostile state actors are actively trying to steal intellectual property, which means they're trying to take our prosperity. And trying to explain this to my 5-year-old, it's not fair. It's stealing.
Right.
And so that's the way at least I see the challenge. Does that resonate with you?
Absolutely, that's exactly the challenge. And so it's why we need to work with private sector to protect Canadian technology and Canadian IP and Canadian advantage, but also understand and use what they have developed, buy from the private sector, partner with the private sector. And it is, I think, critical for us going forward. There's no way we can do it on our own, nor should we. There are opportunities out there, and we should be using Canadian know-how and Canadian innovation to support the work that we're doing in government.
Yeah, it's like a good hockey team. You're the captain, but you're going to need a left winger, right? And
right.
So, yeah.
Or a goalie.
Or a goalie, or whatever, But okay, so let's go to questions from the audience. And here's one that came in, and it's about the national security. It says, national security requires a whole of society approach. I'll pause here for a moment. Not a whole of government approach, a whole of society approach, which I think dovetails well with our previous conversation. The question then reads, are there any plans for a national security strategy to cohere and align the efforts across government?
Well, as I said, I'm not sure that we're writing a 50-page, 200-recommendation national security strategy with things that we're going to do. What we are doing now and what we are seeing more and more is that the national security work, the concept of national security is really whole of government. If you think climate, if you think health and pandemics, and threats coming at us, if you think the legal frameworks that we need going forward, if you think about national defense, foreign policy, trade, development, heritage, because of what is happening in communities and in terms of the rhetoric and the hate out there, it is already a whole of government, I think, problem and responsibility. And I think by being whole of government responsibility, it becomes a whole of society solution, because all of those other departments have contact with and around parts of Canada that we don't in this small community. Economic security is not divisible from national security, isn't divisible from environmental security. And that's how we have to look at it. That is where we are in almost 2024.
Yeah, I really agree, and it resonates with me, and that's actually one of the reasons why CIGI is so dedicated in this space, because for us, it is an ecosystem. We're part of it, and we're happy to chip in too, right? It's not just, government, like it's, this is a whole of society approach, and if we want the country to look the way we want it to look 20 years from now, we're all part of this, and so I appreciate that. So we got a question from Stephanie Carvin. Stephanie is a frequent contributor, does some amazing stuff for CIGI Online.
She scares me a bit.
Okay, so Stephanie writes, it is great that we are modernizing our legislative tools, but we also have a serious capacity issue. What steps do we need to improve our enforcement capabilities?
Well, we certainly need to embrace technology in helping us with assessment and collection of intelligence and understanding what's out there. I don't think you can rely on humans any longer to do that on their own. We do need to augment people. We need to increase the sizes of our agencies, for sure. You see the Canadian Armed Forces talking about needing more people. CSIS and CSE both need more people. And so I think it's both the expansion of the human capacity and the places we are in the world and what we're doing around the world, but it's also embracing technology in a way we have not previously to assist in our understanding because I want the human value to be on what we do with the information, and I want us to use technology wherever we can to collect the information. And that's, covert methods, but it's also open source. And that was one of the things that really came to the fore during the convoy, is that there is a lot of talk out there on social media, and our ability to scrape that information and do anything with it is limited, both in capacity and legislative tools. And so we have to modernize to respond to what's out there. And we have to do this on an evergreen model. You can't let a piece of legislation sit on a shelf unused for 30 years and think it's still going to be fit for purpose. We have to do the same on a number of fronts: our policies, our people, and how we use technology.
Here. I completely agree. And it's, a piece of legislation is not a tombstone, right? I appreciate it's difficult to amend and get it through the system, but that doesn't mean we shouldn't be doing it. And for what it's worth, to your point on the trucker convoy, if I can do better OSINT with a high-speed internet account and a couple of subscriptions than you can, there's something deeply wrong with the system, right?
I'm not allowed to. I desperately wanted to, but I wasn't allowed to.
Right. And so, thinking through the legislative authorities to make sure that we're reflecting the world such as it is, not the world as it was, some 30 years ago. I appreciate that. Okay, we got another question. The world, as you said, is changing rapidly. How do you see the federal government working with private industry to build capacity, innovate, and improve? I mean, we kind of already got to that, but I want to be true to my offer, so to take questions from the audience. So, given the velocity of change that we're seeing, given all the technological evolution, is there anything else you wanted to say about industry and building capacity?
I guess the one thing I didn't mention that I should have was procurement reform. Being able to contract quickly, being able to respond quickly. That's not just a defense problem, it's sort of an everywhere problem. IT support quickly, legally, using all the authorities we have, following the PSPC rules, obviously. But we do need procurement reform to assist on a number of fronts. And so it's not just understanding and developing new technology, it's accessing it in a more effective and efficient manner.
Yeah, and on the procurement stuff too, I'm not an expert in procurement, but at least the way that I read it is that we've got some great innovative companies in Canada, and if we can get our act together on strategic procurement, it's actually a triple bottom line. So number one, you can help Canadian companies in the here and now in their journey to scale, which has merit in and of itself for any number of reasons, prosperity coming to the top of my mind. But then also, if you're buying tech from Canadian companies, then your supply chain is clean. Mm-hmm. And then the third part of the bottom line is that you can, if you're building stuff that people want to buy, you can sell it to our allies. Right. And then their supply chain is clean and you're making some dough out of it. So it's like this self-perpetuating cycle, but it really starts with a strategic look at the way we do procurement so that it is not, this insert collective eye roll moment here every time people start talking about procurement, right?
Yeah, I lived at D&D for quite a few years. We have to reform procurement.
Yeah. Here's a good question. Okay, so I want to come now to this discussion about democratic values, and you started picking up on this. The question says, how do you perceive the breakdown of democratic values in both Canada and internationally as an increased threat to national security?
We've seen unprecedented events. Nobody would have imagined the convoy, except for we should have, because we saw January 6th. We are seeing democracies threatened around the world, election outcomes being questioned, outright lies being told about who has won elections and who hasn't, about the legitimacy of governments. And so I think that's fueled by social media for sure, and I think it absolutely affects national security. We've seen it, we've lived it. And so I don't have easy solutions for it. Some of it starts with the education system, like understanding our system of government. I think that's really critical. I think every school should have civics classes, sort of the grade 6, grade 7 level, but that's just me as a parent more than anything. We've moved away from mainstream media being what influences people, where you have vetted information that is peer-reviewed, that is checked, that you have dual and triple sources for, and people can say anything, and it becomes fact immediately, and that's worrisome. And I am not against, obviously, social media and the advent of how we share information has huge value. It keeps families together, it keeps people connected, but it also has a malevolent aspect to it, and I find that very concerning. You see written in various platforms just bold-faced lies, and the ability of a government to do anything about that is limited, because the people who've written it and are following it are generally not believing what the government has to say. And the government used to be, we in the bureaucracy and ministers, the voice. And it's being countered constantly in a way that is really concerning and threatening. And so democracies have to work together. It's why the G7 is so important. It's why NATO is so important, but the G7 in particular, to try to have unifying voices about elections, freedom of speech, freedom of association, all the things that we value, and ensuring that we protect our own citizens from those who wish to do them harm through things like transnational repression that we have seen in sort of an unprecedented way in the last 5-6 years. It's an enormous worry when democratic institutions are not believed, when the department, the Minister of Health and the Ministry of Health are not believed about a pandemic and what the solution is to trying to stop the spread of a pandemic. And so in 1960, that would have been believed. In 1980, that might have been believed. Wear a mask, get your vaccine, and people would have trotted off to do it. The opposition to it now, because somebody else has said something that is easier to believe, affects the credibility of the democratically elected government. And that's concerning.
There's a lot there.
It was a bit rambly. I apologize.
No. I really appreciate it. And there's just a couple of pieces that I wouldn't mind sitting with for a moment. And maybe I've got a liberty that you maybe don't have, so I can say things that you might not be able to say. But the way that I think about social media is yeah, you're right. Social media is not the problem. It's the business model behind the companies. That's the primary tumor. And the fact is that we've commercialized in people's attention, but it's all about influence. It's the biggest influence machine that the world's ever created, and it's on steroids. You have huge data sets, behavioral ad tech, individualized ad tech. It's created bespoke realities, all with a view to selling you stuff. And look, I don't care if it's like, they're trying to nudge you to buy this toaster or that toaster or whatever, but I do have a problem when it starts to erode social fabric and cohesion. Right. And so on one side of the scale, you've got this tremendous erosion in a shared reality, a common understanding of what it means to live together in a society, and this tremendous amount of division. On the other side, you've got major companies making a ton of dough. And I feel like we're at the stage of this conversation. It's a little bit like when those CEOs testified before Congress on tobacco. I don't know if you remember this, but they all stood up and they're like, I believe nicotine is not addictive. Like, yeah, right. And I feel like we're at that stage of the conversation where it's like, we will get the cigarette machines out of the schools eventually, but it's just, we're in a moment right now where there's large incumbent players that have gigantic vested interests, huge amount of lobbying power, a lot of regulatory capture. And so we're gonna have to live in this reality for a while, but it's, in my mind, it's not the ill of social media and the connection, it's the fact that it's on steroids courtesy of a really sick business model.
And yeah, the algorithms algorithms. The companies have lost control of the algorithms, and we've got a group of youth coming into the age where they will vote, and they'll be part of that population who have learned all of their news online, and it is contributing to the radicalization of youth, and we're seeing that in numbers we haven't previously seen. It is the purpose of what Prime Minister Ardern started on the Christchurch call as a response to what happened in New Zealand, where you spend all your time online, you are fed the same information all the time, and it sends people down terrible paths. So it is not social media, no, but it is the business model, and it is the algorithms, and it is something that is really complex to do anything about.
Yeah, the thing that gets me on this, and I'll move on, I promise, but is the children's mental health and the data there. So CIGI will have a paper coming out shortly by two of our senior fellows, Tracy Viancourt, who is a Canada Research Chair in children's mental health, and Samantha Bradshaw, who's an expert in social media. They've jointly written a paper on the impact on children's mental health. Hashtag it's not good.
No,
and so so I think we're, again, I don't want to go on and on about this, but we have to get ourselves to a place where we're addressing the primary issue, not just the exhaust. Right. But we'll for another day. So here's a question from Brett, who asks about the process of strategic policy development. So he says, how can we speed up the process of strategic policy development and big initiatives, defense policy, GAC transformation, etc.?
I don't know. There's no easy answer to that. The policy cycle is what the policy cycle is, and we are unfortunately driven a bit by 4-year cycles, right? I think the National Security Council will be a help in that, because it will bring the strategic issues to the front and center of thinking, and we will drive the work from there, so that you're not thinking about a defense policy update the day you need to start it. You're starting that work in advance. But policy cycles are difficult, and we're talking about big, complex issues that come with big price tags. And they should be taken seriously. It should be shorter than it is, but I think that if we change sort of our strategic ability to analyze issues, analyze problems, and set a long-term goal, which we will do through the NSC, maybe we can speed that up. But it's been ever thus, and it is an issue for sure.
Maybe somewhat related, there's a question here about the PRC. So they say, great discussion. Thank you very much for that, appreciate it. But very little on the strategic challenge that PRC specifically poses to our interests. Can you elaborate on this?
Well, I think that's been a thread throughout without ever saying it. The PRC is going to be the most populous and country on the planet. It is going to be the largest economy, and they are self-interested at the expense of other countries in a way that we have not previously seen, with a tool set that we have not previously seen. And intellectual property, ports, elections, transnational repression. It has been throughout this conversation that the PRC is a threat. And there is a lot of time and money being spent to ensure that we are countering the threat as best we can. The foreign interference conversation started because of the PRC, the public discourse on it. So it is, I would say that every element in our toolkit and every department in the whole of government is focused on either how we work with the PRC to lower emissions, the environment minister is working hard on that, or the military to ensure that there's freedom of navigation through the South China Sea. They're working on that. And public safety is entirely focused on policy to counter foreign interference, which China has been front and center in terms of the problem set. And so every department across government has an interest in either trying to understand what that relationship is going to be or counter the threat from it. Because I don't think anything is black and white. There has to be a trade relationship. There is a people-to-people relationship. We have a huge Chinese diaspora, but we also have to protect that diaspora from the threats that are coming at them. So it would be lovely if it were a black and white problem. It's not. It is 1,000 shades of gray. And how they operate in Canada is sometimes clumsy and very overt, the police stations, and sometimes very sophisticated. And we're working at a number of levels all the time to understand it and do something about it.
Yeah, no, you're right, because, and not just China, but let's say state actors or adversarial state actors or hostile state actors or whatever the correct parlance is these days are seeking advantage across a range of issues. And so it requires a strategic approach to meet an opposite strategic approach. And so it's not just one thing, but for me, it's really just about not doing whack-a-mole where it's like, look at this, look at this, look at this, but trying to step back, look at the entire playing field and understand, and then setting a vision for where we want to see the country 10, 20 years from now. And like you said, that's a big job, getting those policy arcs right. Here's a question on defense and on CAF, which I think is maybe picking up on what you'd said about navigation and the role that they're playing there in the South China Sea. The question says, you didn't mention the importance of defense as a critical component of national security. Could you please comment on the role of the CAF?
That I did or I did not?
It says you didn't.
Oh.
But you did.
Yeah.
So
it's, again,
I'm just reading the question verbatim here. I'm not correcting people's grammar.
So I think that the Department of National Defence and the Canadian Armed Forces are the operational arm of our foreign policy and our national security policy, along with other agencies on the national security side. Critical to the fight. Challenged right now on a number of fronts. Certainly the impact of COVID and reduced numbers and reduced readiness is impacting them. But if you think about what they've had to do over the last year in terms of the domestic situation and then what they've done abroad, lift, Op Unifier, evacuations out of Sudan, evacuations out of Israel, the continued support to Ukraine, they are, as they have always been, important to who we are as Canada and Canadians and our ability to operate in the world. I'm obviously biased. I'm a military brat. I was the Deputy Minister of Defence, and I think that funding the Canadian Armed Forces is a critical element of whatever our national security and foreign policy is.
Yeah, for what it's worth, I tend to agree. And some weeks ago, I got a tour of our newest ship. I got to tell you, it was a really, really proud moment. And
ships are cool.
Yeah, it was really it was something else. And so I went down and I got to meet the crew and the captain, and we had lunch together and got to know one another a little bit. But it was interesting. They gave me a ball cap. A Navy ball cap, and I'd actually have two sons, so I asked for a second one. So they gave me two caps, and I gave them to both of my boys, and they are so proud to wear those caps. And so all that to say, I definitely very much view DND and CAF is a key pillar of keeping Canadians safe and just being able to make sure we're having that conversation with Canadians about the role that they're playing in the world. I think everyone should have to do a field trip and look at that ship and be part of it, because I found it eye-opening.
More importantly, they should look at the old ones.
Yeah, or look at the old ones, yeah, for sure. And we did talk a little bit about that too, how this one is a lot different. There's another question about disinformation, so I kind of want to circle back to that. They say disinformation is a big problem across the board. Obviously, we'll treat that as a statement. But the question is about working with allies. So do you want to say anything specifically about how you're working with allies to address the problem?
Well, the answer is sort of at 30,000 feet and then sort of at sea level at the same time. So Five Eyes are very focused on mis and disinformation. We just had a group from PCO, led by our Assistant Secretary for Communications, go to the UK and look at what they're doing, the tools they have to look at mis and disinformation. CIGI, CSE, public safety, heritage are looking at how mis and disinformation are affecting us. And it is, I think, under the threshold, the threat of our generation. People are misinformed, they are lied to, and it is deliberate, and it is, in some cases, state-driven, certainly state-amplified by hostile states, and it is not to be underestimated. And the solutions are neither easy nor inexpensive. And I don't actually know what the solutions are. Everybody is dealing with this. You can do one-off call-outs of particular incidents, but it is persistent, and it is pervasive, and it is constant, and it's faster than any of us can do anything about it at this point in time. And so solutions to understand the origins and how to stop it and what to do about it and how to inform when something is very blatantly untrue is the challenge of the moment.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, for what it's worth, I've given some thought to this, and I'll try an idea that I had out on you. Like, I think part of the problem is the amplification, and I think that's one area where we can really address it. And it's a lot of it's bots. Right, and there's that old saying, like, if you tell a lie enough times, it becomes the truth or whatever. And so for me, I feel like maybe there's a strategic approach to the amplification piece. A bot, I'm sorry, it doesn't have a free speech right. And there is proof of concept here with the sanctions regime against Russia. And I wonder out loud whether or not we can lean on that regime. Like, no one wakes up in the morning out of a sense of civic duty and runs a Russian bot farm. Right, like they want to get paid, and so let's make it harder for them to get paid. Let's lean on the sanctions regime and turn off the tap so that we can at least lower the amplification. And for me, that'll help clear out some of the junk. But it's really just
you're just skimming the surface, right? Yeah. I don't disagree with you at all, but you're skimming the surface. And understanding the problem set in detail and then being able to do anything about it are two different things, and the challenge will be doing anything about it. And in bulk, we can hit individual bots, we can hit individual scenarios, but the right to free speech, the freedom of information versus the malevolence of this and the absolute untruth of it and disinformation, it's a complex problem.
Yeah, oh, for sure it is.
Because people do have the right to read and believe what they want to read and believe, right?
Yeah, and they got the right to be wrong too, right?
Yeah.
You have the right to be wrong. For me, it's really about hostile state actors poisoning the information ecosystem and eroding our civic discourse. Absolutely. And especially when it comes to...
But it's all masked, right? What looks like a bot maybe isn't. What isn't a bot is... It used to be really quite obvious, and it's less and less obvious all the time.
Yeah, oh, for sure. And like for me, the part that really gets me grumpy is around elections. Like, we have a principle of state sovereignty, which is like, don't mess in our area. And the reason we have the principle of sovereignty is because there was a 30-year war because people were messing with each other's stuff. And I just worry, like, it's a very dangerous trend that we're on where hostile states are trying to poison the soft underbelly of our democratic institutions. I digress. So there's a question here. I'm going to interpret it a little bit because it's about critical infrastructure in C26. But I'm just going to say, what are your thoughts right now on critical infrastructure? Because it's impossible to pick up a newspaper without a hack on this hospital or this school board or this municipality. And I mean, we're also hooking everything we possibly can up to the internet. And so, would you kind of walk us through some of your thoughts on critical infrastructure and the role that the NSIA and the intelligence community can play in that area?
I think Shelley Bruce should answer that question.
Yeah.
She's the expert. So again, daily occurrence, yes, denial of service primarily attacks. We're seeing increased impacts on provinces and municipalities and private enterprises. I think that Canada government is really relatively well protected through the good work of CSE, but again, we used to think of critical infrastructure being, and it still is, bridges, power stations, hard infrastructure, and now critical infrastructure is broad, and it is how we communicate, how we do just about everything, right? And it affects national security. When Newfoundland had its attack on the hospitals 2 years ago, that's a national security incident in my mind because it means that the province or the entity, whichever it is, cannot provide essential services to their citizens, which becomes, to my mind, is a national security emergency. And so the designation and the understanding of what critical infrastructure is, because it also still is access to airports and access to bridges, as we saw during Convoy. So it is the traditional infrastructure, and it is an entirely new set of elements and structures, whether they are physical or not. And we do have to protect them in a different way.
For sure.
And it's, again, attention and money and technology and staying ahead of it. What we did 6 months ago to protect infrastructure is probably not going to be good enough in 6 months.
Yeah, I tend to agree on the way that you're approaching it. And for what it's worth, this is not shameless self-promotion of CIGI, but we've got a major event called the Waterloo Security Dialogue, where this is our quintessential focus. There are copies of our report from the first Waterloo Security Dialogue on the table outside, but that's exactly right. It's this Team Canada approach to critical infrastructure because, most of the CI in the country is owned by the private sector. It's managed by municipalities, it's managed by provinces in some instances, it's managed by indigenous groups and organizations. It's so diffuse, so you can't just take a federal government approach to it. It's everywhere and it's all things to everyone. And the threat surface is getting bigger and bigger because we're hooking everything we possibly can up to the internet. I was in the store the other day and I saw a toothbrush that you hook up to the internet. Why in God's name you'd ever need to hook your toothbrush up to the internet, I don't know, but all that to say
we bought a new fridge that's connected to the internet and I don't know why. So I agree, it's weird. Does that mean somebody can shut my fridge down remotely if they wanted to? Why would we have bought that and we didn't know? That's the other thing, is you're buying things and you don't know.
Yeah, for sure. I actually don't want to get into it too much, but it's interesting. Like if you go, all of you go home, look at your pillow or your mattress, there'll be a tag on your mattress that'll say new material only and you can't remove it under penalty of law. If you hook it up to the internet, all those consumer protections fall away. Right, so there is the way that we think about data, the way we think about the Internet of Things and connected infrastructure is fundamentally different than the way that we approach the physical world, but the threats are actually greater once you start thinking about the IoT. Probably got time for one last question, and there's an old chestnut in here about foreign intelligence agencies, so I'll just go ahead and ask it. I know this has been kicking around for a long time, but they say there is merit on the CSIS Act modernization, but is that a silver bullet? Do we need to start seriously thinking about a separate foreign intelligence agency?
I think that there's always thought about it, but within the resource limitations that we have right now, I would rather invest in what we have and ensure that the agencies are able to do what they need to do. It's not been something that's been discussed with me recently, and I see David Vigneault has snuck out, so he doesn't have to respond to that as people are leaving. It's not on the policy agenda right now. It may need to be. I think CSIS does remarkable work with the limitations that they have, but I would still rather focus on CSIS Act modernization than standing up a new agency at the cost and time it would take. I think we can do more modernizing the tools that we have available to us now.
Yeah, fair enough. So we got a couple minutes left. Maybe, is there a thought or two you'd like to leave the audience with? If there's a takeaway for everyone, what is that for you?
Well, I think everybody who works in our world sees the world through a pretty dark set of lenses, but I think there's a lot that is positive that is happening in the national security community. I think we're growing in our sophistication. I think we're growing in our understanding of the threats. We're committed to talking about it more. I think the National Security Council is it's a game changer. And I know that one committee shouldn't be that, but it allows that forward thinking instead of the reactive thinking that we have done. I do think, we're still going to respond to emergencies, but long-term strategic thinking about the national security of this country is important. And I think we have to understand that the splendor and isolation that geography has allowed this great nation, we don't have that isolation any longer. All the social media that we've been talking about, the access of the digital world has changed it, but the physical threats also can now reach us. And so we do have to talk about national security differently, and we do need to think about it differently and respond to it differently. Amazing.
So I'm going to offer a final thought or two, but I'll just do a little light housekeeping here. If you've enjoyed this event and you'd like to watch it again or share it with your colleagues, we'll have it on CIGI's YouTube channel shortly. Please subscribe to our newsletter and social media channels to keep up to date on our publications and events. And maybe then let me end where I started, which is with a thank you and a genuine thank you. You've got one of the hardest jobs in the world, and it's particularly vexing because we can't publicly celebrate your successes. Right? If everything goes well, no one knows about it.
Right.
And you've got this kind of unique job where it's like only the failures, only the issues are the ones that land in the newspaper and never the successes. So, I know enough about the world to know how much you're doing for Canadians, the service that you're providing, the level of dedication and skill that you bring to the job every day. And again, not to sound like a sycophant or the chair of your fan club, we really appreciate it. So thank you very much for joining us. Thank you to our audience that's here in the room. Thank you to everyone online. And please join me in thanking our speaker, Jody.
Thank you.